I am here with Kristin W. Roscoe, Esquire. She's a staff attorney at the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. The California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists represents over 32,000 mental health professionals who are licensed to practice in California. And Kristin provides expert legal analysis to CAMFT members on the laws and ethics applicable to their practice through member phone calls and presentations and articles for CAMFT's publication, The Therapist. So welcome, Kristin. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Robin. I'm very excited to discuss coaching with all of your viewers today.
Yeah, well, that's the topic. I mean, what I do is I help mental health professionals to create coaching, training, or consulting programs and to launch and to market them. And some of the most common questions that I get are, what about my license? And what I'm finding is that it can vary a little bit by state. And I thought I'd found some like four golden rules that people should follow. But it sounds like when it comes to California, there might be some slight differences. So that's why I invited you on and wanted to ask you a few questions, if that's okay. And maybe we can get into this topic and see where we go. How does that sound?
Yeah, let's do it.
Very good. So what are the most important considerations for health professionals or mental health professionals in California when they want to put a coaching program or even a training program or a consulting program, but also maintain that active clinical license at the same time? What would you say are the most important considerations?
I think first and foremost, especially for our members, is to protect your license. Here in California, if you're an LMFT, LCSW, et cetera, you've done a lot of work for that license. 3,000 clinical hours in order to even get licensed. So you've done a lot of work to get to that point, and to take those steps to really protect that hard work. That's kind of the goal for most of our members. There is a lot of flexibility that comes with coaching, but at the same time, always kind of having at the back of your mind, I'm also a therapist, right? Never hurts. We like to think in hats. So you only get to wear one hat at a time. You start to look weird if you have multiple hats on. So I always think, when you're in your therapist role, you have your cool therapist fedora, right? Maybe when you're in your coaching world, you've got a cool cowboy hat on now. If you have both a fedora and a cowboy hat on, somebody's going to start asking questions. And so to avoid those questions of, well, which hat are you wearing? That is the goal. And so to take those steps to distance your professional work from your coaching work or other than professional work, the more you can do there to, ensure that those coaching clientele are not confused by the services being offered or rendered, the better off you as a licensee will be. Because thankfully, we haven't heard too many instances of enforcement actions being taken here in California. A lot of our members are governed and regulated by the Board of Behavioral Sciences or Board of Psychology. And so there have been a number of instances where, and we'll see how the enforcement process goes. But we had a member reach out last year who they were working in a coaching capacity with someone in a different state, and that person, it was worst case scenario, basically, where there was some confusion as to what services were being rendered. And so you want to avoid the situation where that coaching client goes home to their best friend and says, you won't believe what my therapist just said. That is, worst case scenario. So again, different, informed consent, different businesses, if you can swing it, as much distance between the two is really what we recommend.
Now, if the coaching model is the delivery model, this is a follow-up question to what you said. If the delivery model is different, let's say it's a group coaching program and there's video curriculum in your program and like a Facebook group for the community, and the coaching calls are run as a group, would you say that's a pretty clear delineation? Or
I
should
would
people
hope
more?
so. Yeah, I would hope so. But at the same time, they're group therapy practices that are run out there. So again, I think in a lot of the coaching models, there is that distance, right? Where there's a set curriculum. You're not doing necessarily something as flexible as therapy can be with them. It's more regimented in a coaching practice for the most part. And so I think, as long as you're keeping those clear lines, again, you don't want to slip up and start, treating that coaching client, right? You don't want to be doing any assessments of that coaching client in that world, right? That is in your professional world, not in your other than professional world.
Got it. Can you disclose your credentials in your marketing when you're speaking about your coaching program?
You can. Again, it's, do those things to lessen confusion. So if you're referring to yourself here in California as an LMFT, you have to include your licensure information associated with it. But then there should be information in there. Maybe I've been a licensed marriage and family therapist for the last 10 years, but I'm a coach, right? And if that is the role that you're playing, spell it out. Don't create that confusion. And also for you in your practice with your coaching client, don't slip up, right? Don't start treating that coaching client. So again, you can refer to yourself as a licensee, but put those caveats and disclaimers in there.
Okay. So like, for instance, one of the best ways I've heard, at least in my untrained opinion, so I'm going to bounce it off you. One of the best ways I've heard of one of my clients doing it is they included a video. And this was in some of their core marketing, but also at the very beginning of their curriculum. And the words they were using is, now, I am a therapist, but I'm not your therapist. This is a coaching program. And then they started to explain the boundaries of it.
Exactly. I love it. It's, exactly what I would tell one of our members, right? That is, first and foremost, I'm a therapist. I'm not your therapist, right? Lay it out there. Don't let there be any confusion. Just as you would set boundaries with your therapy patients, set boundaries with your coaching clients and yourself also, because truthfully, that's where, you have to have those boundaries with yourself and check in, am I providing coaching or am I providing therapy? So you have to, again, stay in your lane, only wear one hat at a time.
Okay. Are separate corporate entities, this is the most common advice that everybody seems to give, and sometimes it's the only piece of advice. So I like to say a little bit more, but separate corporate entities are a good idea for coaching versus therapeutic work.
It's a really complex issue here in California. A lot of our members, if they are forming a corporation, they're forming a professional corporation. Here in California, you're not allowed to do any professional work, whether you're an LMFT, physician, attorney, it doesn't matter what it is, you can't do that under an LLC. So that oftentimes kind of lends itself to someone, if they're going into coaching, to be able to set up that LLC, since that otherwise is not an option. But truthfully, because it is such a complex issue here in California, we always recommend, go speak to an attorney, who's focused on business formations to get that specific legal advice as to what is in your best interest, because every person's, circumstances are unique. Someone may have certain personal assets that they want to kind of insulate that someone else may not have, that, if they have those separate corporate entities, that may offer some additional protection separate from the, can I provide other than professional services under a professional corporation?
Got it. Okay, I understand. What about disclaimers? Do you recommend like a minimum level of disclaimers that people should sign off on prior to entry into your coaching or training or consulting program?
So just as you already said, right, making sure that it's clear, while I'm a licensed therapist, I'm not your therapist. Also, maybe references in there too, if I feel that you may benefit from mental health care, I might refer you to, go seek care elsewhere. Now, the one thing there is you don't want to start assessing your coaching client, right? So it gets a little bit tricky. It's more so recognizing when someone may not be benefiting from the coaching that you're providing, just from a layperson's perspective, if you will, rather than saying, I've done a full assessment of you, you need mental health care, right? That's what you don't want to do. So it's making sure that you just have those disclaimers of, look, here's what I'm doing. I'm a coach. I'm not using my license. If I feel that you might benefit from someone who does have that license, I'm going to make that referral and recommendation for you.
Okay. Well, you touched on it, but if somebody is actually, I'll say probably having a crisis while also in your coaching program, and you started to sort of see some of those signs as a mental health professional. You touched on it a little bit, but what would be a good course of action to take in order to fulfill your oath without implying that you've assessed your client? What would you recommend would be the steps in that situation?
Yeah. So, I mean, here in California, there's no right to confidentiality that would attach to your work with a coaching client. So, there's nothing that stops you from, of course, calling 911, reaching out to someone's emergency contact, or otherwise to make sure that that person, if they're truly in crisis, that they get the support that they need. But if that person is going into active crisis, and again, you you don't want to do an assessment of that coaching client, but if that person is actively suicidal, as a layperson, I can recognize if that's occurring, right? Presumably, that person is not, self-regulating. There's a lot going on there. You can encourage them to self-regulate and do all of those things that a layperson is able to do. But if you start, reaching in your back pocket for that cool fedora to start using those tools that you would use if you had a patient in front of you who was in active crisis, well, then we're starting to blur those lines. So it's more so recognizing that, look, no right to confidentiality in this interaction. I'll get you connected, 911, maybe you need to be evaluated by the pet team, et cetera. But, long term, is coaching a right fit, or, would you maybe more so benefit from some therapy or other care before you re-enter coaching?
So maybe offer to put the program on pause or something while they go through that process, or even, I mean, maybe even refund them if that's an extreme situation.
Right, exactly. And it would just depend on the circumstances of, what was the crisis, right? What was going on for the person? Is it, again, if it's suicidality or something that is coming up from that more mental health perspective, maybe it's a solid pause or refund type situation. But if it's, I just broke up with my boyfriend, I'll be okay, but nothing, acute, maybe it's a pause, and you revisit it later rather than a full stop. But I think, again, it's more so just remembering that you're in that other than professional world where you don't have those same rights and responsibilities to that coaching client that you certainly would if this were a therapy patient.
Got it. Okay. Speaking of blurring the lines, what about coaching programs that might touch on topics described in the DSM? Like, could there be a coaching program that touches on a topic like anxiety or like trauma? And can it be like a coaching program with clients coming from all over the place? Is that something that you would say is okay to do? Is it okay with the right disclaimers, or how would you advise in that situation?
I think it depends. So, as I'm an attorney, right, I can say, you seem anxious. Oh my gosh, right? That's a lot of trauma you're carrying, right? That's a lot of baggage, right? I can say those things fully colloquially. I have, a quarter semester of psychology that I took in high school. I have no clinical meaning behind that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if, as a clinician, you're saying those things, that again, even if you said, I'm a licensed therapist, but I'm not your therapist, that has more weight behind it. So I think if you are using those more clinical terms, you have to be extremely careful and only, refer to them in that kind of layperson's way, right? You're not relying on anything from the DSM. You're not looking at, you meet diagnostic criteria, right? Again, that's implying some level of assessment. So I think if you're using those terms as a layperson would, again, you just have to be very cautious in doing so and ensure that you're not approaching it from a clinical perspective that would require the license, that especially if you have someone who's not here in California, if they're in New York or elsewhere where you would need a license to practice with that person, that certainly is setting you up for, a possible complaint of practicing without a license.
Got it. Okay. A clinician is guided by their code of ethics, but that doesn't apply to coaching, right?
Yeah.
So what principles would you suggest that somebody would follow when they're working, or a clinician should follow when they're working in a coaching capacity?
Yeah, again, it's, kind of having that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to yourself, right? It's,
Mm-hmm.
on one hand, you have your ethics, that guide you as a clinician, but your CAMFT code of ethics, if you're a CAMFT member, those don't apply to your coaching world. So maybe if you've gone through a particular program, maybe they have certain guidelines that might apply to a certificate that you obtained through that program. But frankly, you don't even need a certificate in order to call yourself a coach. So it's more so, again, you don't want to rely on your professional code of ethics because it doesn't apply to the coaching world. So it's more so familiarizing yourself with what is coaching, because I think that frankly is the starting point of what is coaching. All too often when I pose that question to people, there's no great answer, right? There's no distinction that is articulable. So you have to have that articulable distinction between what is your professional work and what is your coaching work. And so once you're able to articulate how those very much differ, then hopefully you're able to look to, okay, maybe I'll look at the guidelines put out by this coaching organization and draw upon those in my work. But you're not reaching to your professional work to be guided by your ethical principles because they're not applicable.
Is it the same answer about the right to confidentiality?
Yeah. So here, in California, the right to privacy is ingrained in the California Constitution. But beyond that, there's no right to confidentiality that attaches to any coaching work. So if you're in your clinical work with a patient, that person even just reaching out to you to seek services, there's that right to confidentiality in seeking those services. Once they're your patient, the psychotherapist patient privilege attaches to your work. As a coach, none of that is applicable. So you don't really have, yes, you still have that right to privacy. Arguably, if something is shared with you in confidence, given how California's constitution is worded, you probably aren't popping up on Facebook to say, gee golly, guess what I just heard from my coaching client, but you might be able to, right? So you really do have to be guided by, okay, what is it that I'm going to be comfortable sharing? What is, but again, if I send you a subpoena for your coaching records, if they even exist, because you're not obligated to take records, I can get it because there's no right. There's no privilege that attaches to that work. So it's again just making sure that you're clear in terms of what is it that I'm providing, what is required of me. If it's coaching, maybe if you have a certificate, maybe if those that program recommends certain things, you're guided by that program. But otherwise, again, it's the cowboy hat, it's the Wild West. And on that front, I would just say that the Board of Behavioral Sciences, which again regulates most of our mental health professionals here in California, this is a topic of interest for them. So they've started to discuss coaching, and not necessarily the idea of regulating coaching itself, but more so the idea of doing some consumer education on the issue to be able to help the public understand the difference between professional therapists and coaching work. So that is something that they began discussing at the beginning of this year and will continue discussing next year. So there is no regulation at this point in time, but I would just say that, in the future, that's something that might shift. And, if it's happening in California, it could be happening elsewhere.
Understood. Very good. One follow-up question that's just coming to me right now is if a therapist wants to launch a coaching program, I've heard two different attitudes to this question. One of them is I cannot in any sense announce this program to people who have had therapy with me previously but aren't now. And then other ones don't seem to think that's so much of a problem so long as it's not a current therapeutic relationship. Where would you fall in that situation? I mean, should they announce it or should they just go straight out to people who have never heard of them before and promote it that way instead?
The attorney in me much prefers the latter option, but I would just say, it's much easier to go from a coaching relationship into a therapeutic relationship from an ethical perspective. So as a therapist, once you're someone's therapist, you're always that person's therapist. And so there's a much greater weight that comes with having known that person on that much deeper level that, again, we always hope that there wouldn't be those issues of coercion or anything associated with that work if you were to transition over to a coaching relationship. But to do so from a therapeutic into a coaching relationship, you have to be just so exponentially more mindful of that. Again, if it's a current patient, if it's a current patient, there may be aspects of your work with the therapy patient that incorporate some coaching in the treatment plan, and you're hopefully very clear in terms of what that entails for that patient, rather than switching them entirely over to both therapy patient and coaching client. Because again, two hats, it's a dual relationship. Not all dual relationships are unethical, but you have to be very much aware of, again, the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. Is this person reaching out to me as my patient or my client, right? How do you make that distinction if you're doing that at the same time? Now, if you've terminated with the patient, and some time has passed, the Code of Ethics and the laws here in California don't say how much time should pass, but you should never be in a situation where today I'm your therapist and tomorrow I'm your coach. We've heard that a lot. I'll just say over the last 2.5 years, due to the pandemic, when a lot of people were moving out of state, and there were those licensing law concerns of, well, I'll just start treating that person as a coaching client. Well, you have to take a step back, and what is in that patient's best interest? If they need professional mental health care, that might be something where you're terminating and referring that person. If they need coaching support because they've met all of their treatment goals and everything is good on that front, you're going to terminate with them anyway. Again, you want some time to pass between your end of your work and beginning of that coaching relationship, again, so that you're not blurring those lines. But what that looks like, obviously up to your clinical judgment, being very mindful of your prior history with that former patient and going forward, and especially because they are a former patient, making sure that you're doubly hitting all of those disclaimers, being very clear as to what it is you're providing and what it is that you're not.
Very good. Thank you. This helped a lot. I appreciate your time today. Is there anything else that you'd like to add at this point? I know that we got a lot of questions out of you in the last almost 30 minutes.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. We have a great article on our website, Coaching versus Therapy. So if you just go to CAMFT.org, my colleague Sarah wrote that a while ago, but still very much applicable today. And I'm always happy to speak with any CAMFT members on the topic.
Very good. Thank you so much for your time, Kristin. And we have your contact details. How would they get in touch with you? Would get in touch with you by calling the organization?
They can, yes. And we have all of our contact information at CAMFT.org. So C as in Charlie, A, M as in Mary, F as in Frank, T as in Tom.org.
Very good. And if you're interested in putting together a coaching program or a training program or a consulting program, and you're looking for help in order to get that into the market, then you can also head over to thepowerfulpractice.com/apply. Thank you.
Thanks.